Hi everyone, my name is Fredrick Chen. I am 20 years old. I'm a senior at NYU. I live in New York City and I am a content creator.
My name is, Dr. Sherry Wang. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a Taiwanese American and an immigrant woman. I came to the US at the age of 6 and grew up in California from Los Angeles, but now I'm in the Bay Area. I'm an associate professor of counseling psychology at Santa Clara University in the Bay Area. I'm also a licensed counseling psychologist, and in the last year and a half, I've been doing a lot of media interviews and, domestically with kind of mainstream media, but also with foreign media, as well as with Chinese speakers in the US, trying to really talk, right, about anti-Asian racism and the importance of combating it and how do we do it.
I'm Professor Russell Jung. I teach at San Francisco State University in Asian American Studies, and I am co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Wong. I'm a third year at UC Berkeley studying political science and global studies, and I go by she, her pronouns. I was born in San Francisco and I moved to the greater Bay Area, though my family is from Hong Kong and I speak fluent Cantonese. I speak the language with my family. As for what I do, I currently serve as an AOCC senator for UC Berkeley, the Associated Students of the University of California, and outside I'm involved in a lot of government work, nonprofit work, and advocacy as well, with a specific focus on the Asian American community.
I try to see myself as just because I'm only 20. It's like I'm just like every other LGBT Asian American living their life. I just happened to gain a platform for it, but I didn't really go into my identity as I didn't really say, oh, I'm Asian American and feel comfortable with that until I would say junior, senior year, because I just started meeting more Asian people in general. And online, I found it was more accepting to watch people like Eugene Lee Yang, Michelle Phan, comedians who else am I thinking of? Well, nowadays, Mina Lee, who's an amazing content creator in New York City. Ali Wong, as I saw more representation show up besides Mulan, it made me feel more comfortable to be in my own skin because I wasn't surrounded by other Asian people besides my parents and my two close friends. I didn't really speak the language outside of school, or I can say it, but I can't write or understand it by reading.
Okay, I'm fifth generation Chinese American. And so a lot of what's happened throughout Asian American history, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Angel Island detentions, the segregation and discrimination that Asian Americans face, my family's experienced. So I grew up in San Francisco. Even though I'm fifth generation, I went to Chinatown a lot, and so we were connected in that way. And I saw how immigrants worked so hard, but lived in poverty and in hard conditions. And so that really shaped me and my subsequent activism, my desire for justice, my recognition that America isn't equal or fair, and that I wanted to make things right. And so I think in that way, knowing my family history and knowing how immigrants had difficulties, I think that part of my Asian background shaped my subsequent background of wanting to help other Asian Americans. I recognize I had a lot of privilege, but I wanted to use that responsibly to help others.
As I mentioned, I'm an immigrant and I'm a child of immigrant parents who came to the U.S. to a suburb in LA at the age of 6. So I feel like with immigrants, we straddle multiple worlds, and not just the country of origin and the host country, but also generationally, right? Seeing the sacrifices our parents make, that they continue to make, trying to reconcile what kind of mainstream and current generation kind of expectations are like with our own families. And so for me, growing up in a predominantly Asian community, I think that's a big part of who I am today.
Yes.
And what has shaped me, because the reason I became a psychologist and my specialty is in immigrant and refugee mental health. That was what I went to get my doctorate for, right, as a counseling psychologist, because I grew up in an Asian community and yet there was so much diversity amongst us that people didn't know about. But when you're growing up in it, you don't know. And so I just, I knew I was really privileged, right? And things like having two parents, being in a family that's very being voluntary immigrants as opposed to being involuntary, right? Refugee kind of families, having class privilege even, right? And tied alongside to our kind of migration process. And so a lot of things that I really wanted to advocate for in going into psychology was being able to not only just understand our communities and the diversities, because people don't usually think about Asian Americans beyond like the stereotypes of high achieving, right? The model minority myth, things like that. But they don't know things like Asian gangs, for example, or what happens when you fail as an Asian American. And so there are a lot of things that I felt like we needed to educate mainstream perspectives from a perspective about Asian Americans that isn't deficit based, right? So to not have people tell our stories when they don't know our cultures, plural, right? Because it's really diverse. And so to really make sure that I also was able to kind of recognize my own privileges, right? To be able to advocate for other communities. Because if you think about it, most people only know about like Chinese, Korean, Japanese, the big three. And so I do think it's incumbent for us, right? I identify as Taiwanese American and Chinese as well, to speak up for my South Asian, my Southeast Asian siblings in ways that would be different if non-Asian Americans spoke about our communities and tried to understand us in a way that was probably more like all Asians are this way.
When I ran, I decided to run on something I personally believe in, which is something for everyone. And I found it sort of unique. At Berkeley, what you usually do is run based on your community interests. And obviously I wanted to keep as much as everyone's interests in mind. And that was not only difficult, but I found it a very rewarding experience, frankly. I really wanted to focus on the Asian American community at Cal during my campaign and in my work, just because I see a lot of issues underneath that have yet to be addressed. And I have not seen anyone, frankly, to be quite honest, addressing these in the Senate thus far. I actually heard from someone a really interesting piece of information. I'm apparently the first ASUC senator to be Hong Kong descent, which is incredibly interesting and incredibly overdue. And some of the issues that I'm seeing is there's a lot of number one, everyone believes that the AAPI community is a monolith when that is not true at all. You have, West Asians, Southeast Asians, South Asians, East Asians, Pacific Islanders, and not to mention Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians. They span across over 54 islands. We're talking about Melanesians, Polynesians, and Micronesians, right? And so we're an incredibly diverse group, and that really does get overlooked at Berkeley, especially when resources are being distributed and issues and platforms are being discussed. So that's one thing. I really wanted to bring the AA and HPI community together, especially after the traumatic event, especially this year with the coronavirus pandemic and the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. One of the strategies that was heavily relied on by people outside of the community, even within the community, was this notion that, oh, well, Asian Americans just remain silent, and so we don't hear them, right? And I too once believed in that notion. I thought, well, a lot of people in my community, they tend to just mind their own business. They tend to say, let's keep moving on. It'll bring less trouble to myself. But a lot has happened since then that has definitely changed my worldview. And one of those occurrences is through speaking with my mother about all of this, right? And how she's been feeling. She's a first-generation immigrant from Hong Kong. She speaks Cantonese way more fluently than she does English. And she's been fearing for her life too. And we were talking about this, and she said, Stephanie, it's not about Asian Americans being silent, but it's about, is anyone hearing us? And that left very deep impact and impression on me. And I realized that she was correct. Is anyone even listening to us? Right? I think recently there are more and more people listening to us in politics and government and across work sectors. But prior to that, no. So I think we really need to unlearn this notion of Asian Americans are silent. No, that is a cultural stereotype that's been forced upon us. We're actually speaking up very loudly, but the other side also needs to listen.
I mean, definitely there is that stigma of like to be more docile and I guess like reserved about these topics, because if you are outspoken and controversial, the thing is like they look down upon you. I remember my parents told me like, just do well in school, don't cause too much drama, like behave, you know. The whole emphasis is on like achieving your goals instead of trying to jeopardize it. Yes. I'm more combative when I see those aggressions towards Asian peoples. And I've always said, in order to change people's minds, especially like older people like our parents or grandparents, people who immigrated from Asia, who don't understand like American culture as much, it is important to make them realize like, this is my future that I'm talking about, instead of like, I'm looking out for you, but it's also like, you need to understand this is what it's going to be like for us if we don't change it. So I wouldn't say it's called pressuring your parents, but it's almost like raising awareness for them that like, this is my child, I should care about as well.
I do think that's not so much about like, because we are not courageous or because we're scared. I think those were strategic things that our families taught us, because in the societies that they grew up in, that's how you succeeded, right? I often think that when we think about why Asian Americans, you know, put their heads down, put up, shut up, right? And only kind of stay our lanes. It's really because we don't know the rules of the game in this society, right? And this is why I think like education is so important. And I do think that, you know, to mobilize Asian Americans, the strategy, and I do think this comes from my psychologist identity and my psychology background of doing trauma-informed work, is that we want to empower people, right? And galvanize people rather than shame them and blame them. And I find that is also very cultural, the shame piece, right? But shame does not sustain, right, people's momentum to change. And so I think in that way too, you know, if we did more education for our families to let them know, you know, the way to get a promotion, right, for example, isn't to shut up and put up. It's actually to stand up for ourselves and to speak up and to make waves and to, you know, even ripples. Like that is how it works now.
There's not much you can do about what other people think about us. There's not much you can do about government policies. So keep your head down, work, and just take care of your family. And that's actually a really valid response. So I want younger generations, first of all, don't try to change your immigrant parents. First, you got to acknowledge that's a really rational, reasonable response. If in all their lives, they recognize that governments are oppressive, that white people are racist, that we're new to this society and don't have that much power, it sort of makes sense then to just focus on what you can control rather than trying to change what's uncontrollable. So we don't want to be silent, but we also want to be heard. And so then as we're not silent, we could say things in ways that still make us unheard. Right? We could go to the extreme from, okay, we're not going to be silent, so we're going to be angry and loud. But it's really hard to hear angry and loud people. And oftentimes angry, loud people don't get heard. They're just expressing their anger and loudness, but not expressing the content, maybe not even expressing the hurt and the pain well. The point is, for me, how can we be heard and get our issues addressed well? And so that means learning how to speak well so that others can hear us with empathy. And the way you get other people to hear your pain, your heart, what you want to see change, is that you first listen to them. And once they say their piece, then usually people are open to listening to you. Colonization and violence have actually made us more silent, right? We've been oppressed. And so we've been silenced by the courts in America. We haven't been given voting rights. So there's a pattern of not speaking because it doesn't work in America. And if you come as an undocumented person like my grandparents, it doesn't make sense to stand out. So there's a lot of systems that make us the silent group. You know, when we're at home, when you're riding the bus in Chinatown, people are loud. When you're at Dim Sum, people are loud. But among broader society, Asians are more quiet because we haven't had power. Speaking out hasn't always helped. So being silent has been an adaptive measure. It's been also an oppressive measure. So it's not part of our culture to be silent. It's part of the system that's made us silent. The way to stop that cycle of violence, the way we have to speak out, is to learn how to reimagine conflict, how we reimagine resistance.
True change doesn't come from like, I don't think it can just come from social media anymore, because like it's always been through protests, through knocking on doors, you know, calling politicians, like being at the epicenter of where change happens, because the way our government works, like it's with the people of power. So being able to reach them, to contact them, even calling senators, you know, it can even start like within your own high school. I think people underestimate the power that students have when they group together. Raising awareness by making Asian American clubs. If that isn't there, you know, if you're in a rural town, make one, you know, be the one who starts that. Go up to your principals and your teachers and say like, can you talk about this? History teachers, can you mention this? But the important part is like, you have to know what to mention, because if you're not even aware of it, they're not going to care. So I think it's putting a lot of pressure for like high schoolers and college students to have to know everything in order to educate the older generation. But unfortunately, that is how the world works. It's like the younger people, at least Gen Z, is more outspoken than ever before. So I think we should continue that stereotype and be outspoken.
So I think the more younger people could recognize the way others are adapting, valid and fair, then if you could empathize with them, maybe they could empathize with you who are different. But then, you know, so you understand their point of view, and then you say, but then you share about how it makes you feel. Like, I see what's happening to our elders, and I gotta make it safe for them, right? Yeah. And I think we call this approach is deep empathy. Is that just really trying to understand each other. And the more you try to understand the older perspective, then more ready to hear how you feel. On the other side, you don't try to lecture but rather share your heart. Just share what you believe and try to understand their point of view.
I think this way of thinking about it is so empowering. It gives so much hope and motivation to be like, what are the different strategies that I can try to help you think a different way? Yeah. As opposed to shame, mom and dad, you need to think differently. I can't believe you're so backwards. I can't believe you don't have a bone of social justice in you, because it actually then perpetrates that white supremacy lens of us looking down on our families, thinking they're less than and that they're inferior, and they're not.
It's always to show respect, and the most important part is to show that you are an ally for them. Like, there is a lot of anti-Blackness within the Asian community, especially from immigrants in general, especially our parents, like older generations, just because, I mean, like, darker skinned people aren't as common in Asia, and if they are, they're looked down upon. Like, there's like a lot of deep colorism in there as well, because they're misinformed about that. Those teachings can be taught to our own like fellow peers.
It has cross-racial solidarity and coalition building is the answer. Like, the answer is very clear, actually. It's not a complicated answer. And it really is about us building our communities together. And I say that even to include white allies, because people think that I'm being anti-white. No, I'm anti-white supremacy, which is a system of racism. But there are so many good white allies, and we need white allies. We need people who get to be in the rooms and get to sit at the table and who get to, like, you know, make decisions and then speak for us and on behalf of us. And when we have opportunities to be in the rooms, to speak up, then we got to speak up for those people who aren't there. We need to speak up for our Native American siblings, right? We got to speak up for Black people who are not there, and our Latinx communities. We got to speak up about disability, right? About classism, like all of these things, because that's what community is. It means like other people will look out for you, and we will look out for other people. Very different than a tit for tat thing. Like, if you look out for me, then I will look out for you. Right. So I think it's an intrinsic motivation that can't be ignited by shame, right? Because we need it to sustain and be motivated over time. We care about the whole society, and when we win, everybody wins.
Yes.
And so I think understanding that helps us see that, like, this is why when Asian Americans do well, other communities will do well. When Black communities do well, all of us can do well. That mentality, I think, allows us to then encourages us to want to pull ourselves and each other up, rather than fall into this white supremacist competition of we will fight to the death, right? So that we can get that 1% slice of the pie. It's like Squid Games.
Another important part of social media is to prioritize who you support, because if the top numbers are always, dominated by white creators and people who are, no shade, only doing dance moves, I would say, like, if you only want to subscribe to that, go on ahead. Like, I'm totally for that. But if you want to see yourself represented, it is actively searching for Asian American creators, Chinese characters, Chinese creators, Indian creators, Cambodian, like finding your own culture in order to feel represented and know that just because I'm subscribing to them, that will possibly help someone else see them on the feed, because we don't grow without other people's support. We can make the best content and be on the same level of professionalism and creativity as another creator, but based on skin color, and like that can totally change how we're pushed, because it is biased. The algorithm always like feeds you what you watch and what you already look at.
I do think so. I think one of the big points that I do want to make, though, is that if we continue to only focus on hate, like stop Asian hate, we really won't make that much change, because the reality is most of the common, daily, frequent racism that happens in general, right? But since we're talking about Asian Americans, for Asian Americans is covert and complicit. It's in the form of microaggressions.
Yes.
Right. It's about our invisibility and our lack of representation. That we are oftentimes, in diversity programming or initiatives that have to do with racism, Asian Americans aren't even included. Like funding mechanisms, like the National Institutes of Health have had like 0.12% funding, right, of clinical research on Asian Americans. So people don't think of Asian Americans as in an underserved or underrepresented group. And so I think we really need to think more about microaggressions and the subtle ways in which Asian Americans are often excluded and just forgotten altogether, right?
Yes.
That then ultimately leads to things like hate. But it doesn't, to tell people like stop Asian hate, most people will be like, not me, I don't hate Asians. You must be talking to them, right? When if the question is really more like, well, are we all complicit in some degree of racism, of treating Asian Americans as invisible, right?
Yes.
Of not thinking about Asian Americans as people of color? Are we all responsible for that in some ways, including Asian Americans? The answer is yes.